Oh, and good evening. It's December 10th, 2024, and we're continuing our discussion collection in our Outside the Class series. This series, the Bible Project, covers the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have those source videos set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. The lectures can be found in that source video playlist. We try to keep these to about 15 minutes, make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and maybe different twist on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, then please click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, right? In the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So we'll get past the first 5. Could get interesting. But we need to remember, the videos we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. We're going to ask a lot of questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Deuteronomy, Devarim, right? This is our part 3. So as the source video says, as we make we'll make them different, these people, these children of Israel, right? What's going to make them different is not because they're physically different people, right? It's because of what they do as those people. That's what's going to set them apart. Because this comes from a particular family, I'll agree. The beginning with Abraham and his lineage is going to play out. But being a child of Israel is but the beginning. And what we're seeing are those that say, found out first, right? So what they do is going to be different. That's what's going to separate them. It's not a statement. It's not the wish, the vote, the prayer, one-point isolated incident. We see that with Sinai. We see that because we first committed to follow these guidelines at Mount Sinai, right? We, meaning the us-them game, right? So now we have the subsequent 40 years that we've just seen, and they're at this moment where Moses has to reiterate. He needs to remind. He needs to refresh them on different expected behaviors. Because I do like how Tim put it. In doing this, we're going to show 2 things about God, which God deems his character traits. You're going to see these 2 things. We're going to see wisdom. We're going to see justice. Because it's interesting because wisdom and justice are only experienced by doing, right? It's not a picture. It's not a thing. It's not something you put on your mantelpiece. Not a card you carry in your wallet. Wisdom and justice, they're expressed each through action. Devotion. Tim used the word devotion, and I loved it. We understand that from a friendship standpoint, right? We understand that from a marriage standpoint. And now God asks them to only be devoted to me. I guess so maybe the question could be, what does devotion really mean to us then, right? And how vital is that singular devotion to each of us? Because it seems to be one of the points, one of the questions, one of the concerns that Moses has as he reiterates this to them, that it hasn't been taken seriously enough. That's why he needs to have this reiterated. And I think it's a bit of a surprise that Tim used that. I mean, I liked the part where he talks about other gods. He's cautioning against them because they degrade humans and destroy communities. That's there. So that's the thing to talk about. Because they understand other gods. This is not a new concern for them. They're very aware that other people that follow these other gods, that part of what those other gods' expectations are. So do we ever stop to think about what these other gods or the implications of these other gods and what their expectations were for them? Because I like this. And it's a subtle point. I think it's a big point, really, to make from a subtle one. But it concerns the expectations of our God versus the expectations of these other gods. Because at some points, they are very, very different. I mean, one point we see is that all these other gods expect to be pleased, right? They expect to be placated. They expect those that are serving to satisfy that God's needs. They take it to a temple, right? But our God is very different. I mean, we already see that in that this God is more concerned about how you act amongst yourselves, right? He's very concerned about how we treat all the people around us. Does God expect reverence towards him? Yes, he does. But if you notice, all that reverence towards him is expressed through how we treat other people. Does that sound familiar? I mean, the Messiah even says, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, strength, right? Everything that you are. And you do that. And with that is love your neighbor as yourself. These are equally important to God. And they are both expressed through Torah. As we get there, like Tim said, we get to the center of the book, the center of Deuteronomy. And it's the reiteration of the collection of the instructions for them on how to behave amongst themselves, right? How to act and interact with each other daily. And that will be an example to those on the outside looking in. It's not just about us acting on our daily lives to ourselves, but it's also for example. Remember, this is not a list of what you need to bring to God so that God will do something for you. Because I think that's a misperception of what we term the sacrifices in Scripture, the offerings and the sacrifices. It's there for God, and I think it's there to express how we have broken our part in what he asked in this covenant behavior. And maybe this sounds a little weird, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to put it. But it's almost like God is telling us, you'll need this so that you understand the importance, the severity, and the value of my ways, right? In those sacrifices and those offerings. Because when there is a breaking of this communal behavior, because it hurts not only yourself, but there's a more significant impact on the community. And by extension, do you ever think about this? The actual reputation of God, because that's what he says. Because as representatives of this priestly nation, as those being looked at, this is the expectation, right? I mean, if God treats people this way, I want to follow that God. But if we don't behave in a certain way, are we showing the people that God doesn't treat people that way, right? Because you're a representative of God, yet you don't treat people that way. Does that confuse them? I mean, it's an ugly question. It should cause us concern. So when you look at these instructions, look inside. Find out if there's anything that's driven toward God saying, this is so that you make me happy. Or is it more about whether this helps you understand the importance of not engaging in this behavior and whether it affects your loving your neighbor as yourself? So this center section, as Tim puts it, they're broken into 3 sections. Not uncommon, right? The first one is Israel's worship, which would be the toward God maybe part of the equation, where God and us interact in a way that we, as obedient servants, would be serving a king, right? Because this is not a leaderless society. It's very much a society with the expectations of respect for leadership. Starts at the base level of parents. We see that in the 10 words and the instructions surrounding Israel's worship. But it's interesting that when he talks about worshiping God, I'm not sure where this goes even in my head. So an answer for me is that this is one of those places where there's just one temple and one place where God said, this is where I'm going to be. Maybe because there's many other gods that have multiple locations. And this is the only one God who says, this is my space. This is my only space. What's that mean? That's open for discussion. Because I love this, where the discussions can go. So please, discuss this. Because yes, it does raise many issues. I think they're worthy of discussion. But in that segue, as it's expressed, as we've talked about before, so this is one of the biggies. How do we treat the poor? Because Tim then talks about the tithe and the money that's set aside for those purposes, right? Because there are multiple places where money is set aside for purposes. One of them being the 10th we give to the temple, right? What the temple takes care of. One of the most significant parts of that they remember is for the priest, right? For the Levites. But then we also have that other 10th inside these instructions that are things like not to glean from your edges of your field, not reaping all the fruit, but we have this extra 10th given out of every 3 years to the poor. So yeah, seems like a perfect time to repeat it, just because it's worth repeating and it's interesting. Why would the death of Messiah mean that all of these concerns now be null and void, right? Because the Messiah died. We don't need to give to the poor. We don't do that. Those instructions on how we guide ourselves and the examples we use are no longer relevant. Does that sound almost like dismissive behavior? Because I think that in and of itself can be a very cautionary tale. But in the following section, right, it describes the character of leadership, right? The expectations inside this covenant community. And they're under the authority of this set of instructions. All of them are under the authority. Remember, this is God's will on earth expressed. Because I had the feeling that God was in charge. So this goes for the elders. Then it goes for the priests. And it goes for kings. They will put themselves under the authority of this covenant, of the word of God, the will of God put on earth. This means everything they do, how they express their leadership, how they express their community care, and the justice are all based on this set of instructions. Every king. Chew on that for a little while. It's interesting, though, that God says, hey, just in case, let's go check it out, that I have people, these prophets, right? So they're going to speak for me. They're going to make sure that you stay on this path. Because if you don't, they're just going to keep reminding you of the path. The one that you're supposed to be on, that you're supposed to get back to by doing the ways of Torah, yeah? Because that's the purpose of the prophets. The purpose of the prophets is to bring you back to God's ways, not to tell you the future. Theirs is to call you back to God's ways, to point out what is in God's ways that you're not paying attention to, and that needs to change. So when we get to this last section where there are civil laws, they talk about marriage, family, business, which again asks the questions that I asked earlier. Why would these go away? Because Messiah died. Why would all of a sudden say how you treat your family, how you treat those intimate to you, how you treat all the others around you? How is being fair and truthful in business no longer part of the equation? I mean, many of those very lessons were brought up in the parables. Because I think an essential part of this section is to protect the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. So why would their protection disappear? I think the point is that we've gotten away from that because we're not. I think we're seeing that today. That is a result of our lives living in this world around us. The fact that we don't do this is showing this exact case. So when we go back and we read some of these cautionary tales, we see what happens when the caution is, if you don't, then. That's when we pick up a mirror and we say, what do we see? So yes, maybe I need a reminder. Maybe I need to be emboldened so that you can do this. And the land you'll move to, for them, will be wonderful when I do. And we heard that report card 40 years ago. But imagine what it's going to look like then. I think this is why the scroll of Deuteronomy is so essential, right? It's their reminder. It's our reminder. It's an account of the story to ensure that Moses prepares this group of grown-up children and reminds them of their forefathers' vow and their commitment to God's accountability for them. This has made this look into the scroll of Deuteronomy so much fun, and yet I believe so vital, right? The purpose of this story is different from that of the scrolls before, in a way, which is why we get that Genesis chapter 2 deja vu feel on this scroll, right? So it's going to be fun to continue this journey for our last episode. So thanks for with us tonight. Another Outside the Class episode on the Dusty Feet.